I think there's a great opportunity now for realizing value. There's a great deal of value that's been left on the table. We've had significant extensions of technical systems, and the technical systems are built on the universal laws of physics. And what they're bumping up against now is the not universal laws, not even global laws of people and cultures and habits and norms and ethics and experiences and historical periods. And so all of those things have yet to be realized, and it's not really a matter of engineering per se. It's really a matter of having some other metrics that are non-engineering metrics, perhaps from the humanities, from law, from economics, a variety of other areas that to the extent these technologies interact with people, they're really better described as socio-technical systems. And we have lots of measurements and quite a bit of understanding, I think, about the nature of the technical elements, but less about the socio part. And so I think there's a great deal of opportunity there. The early meetings of the Distributed Ledger Foundation, I think, have revealed some very interesting opportunities for both businesses that are new businesses, startup businesses, and for existing businesses. There's been a lot of speculation about how blockchain and other types of architectures of technology and combinations of technology might help to serve existing business interests and to grow new value propositions. And I think what's starting to happen through the Distributed Ledger Foundation is a recognition that there are a variety of areas that we need new metrics in, need new concepts and structures of thinking about. Not that we necessarily need new technology for the things, but new ways of using the technology and deploying the technology so that we can address some problems that are being left unaddressed and in fact weren't addressed in earlier instantiations of organizations that now dominate the landscape. So there's a really exciting opportunity, I think, for some new value to be extracted from existing technologies. You know, I think one of the things, I think I read that there were several hundred different coin-type offerings out there of a variety of different types. And so one of the things I think is going to happen in this area is that something external to the actual technical architectures is going to start to create normalization among the value propositions. And so I think that what I expect to have happen from the Distributed Ledger Foundation is to start to allow for the identification of, again, new metrics and new value propositions, new performance metrics. Let me be more specific about the metrics. New ways of looking at a system, again, a socio-technical system, engaging performance so that you can start to gauge threat and vulnerability, start to have an understanding of risk, but also start to have an understanding of when you don't have risk, and so people can start to understand when systems can be trusted more. And that idea of trust is something that's really interesting in this context because the technical systems allow us to start to look at reliability as a gateway to trust, just a mechanistic form of trust where we can, when I say that I step on the brake of my car, I trust it'll stop the car. That's not an unusual sentence. But there's different kinds. That's not grandma kind of trust. And if the brake of my car isn't stopping the car, maybe the stock price of the car manufacturer will start to go down. And that's a different kind of trust. So it's really transferable. So I think with the technology, it allows us a glimpse of mechanistic trust. And I think part of the question is, how do we take that mechanistic trust, that mechanistic opportunity to de-risk future interactions, and to convert that into something which is not just the technical trust, not just the reliability of the technical system, but rather the reliability of the systems the technology touches. I think there's a fantastic opportunity to do that, as there has been for other technologies. Think about photography, other communications technologies, information technologies in general. When they've had an ability to make information persistent through time, that's always had a de-risking opportunity, and it's always been utilized by different businesses and new value propositions to have that, to be able to stretch time and to have that information have that persistence through time so it can de-risk future interactions. And I think there's a great opportunity for blockchain-based technologies and other similar approaches to start to allow for those to be realized, those value propositions to be realized. And I think the Distributed Ledger Foundation can play a really significant role in starting to unearth some of those opportunities, some of those metrics, and also to start to help in the development of some of those things, because identifying them is one thing, but then we have to figure out, well, how do we get from where we are now to where we need to be in some of these, again, existing institutions and new startups and new value propositions. I think this is a really exciting time for lawyers, and I'm a real cheerleader for the law and the idea of legal practice. But if you think about it, there wouldn't be lawyers if there wasn't risk. We wouldn't exist. There wouldn't be insurance if there wasn't risk. We thrive on risk in a way, which sounds very devilish, but it's intended to help de-risk. Well, we know that there's significant risk now, and we know there's significant risk in a whole variety of areas that isn't being addressed by existing institutions. So for lawyers, there's an opportunity for us to understand and help people to deal with risk. You know, what we do in law very often is take risk and put it in a package and move it around. And it sounds funny to say, but that's when you talk about rights and duties. When someone takes on a duty in a contract or a regulation, they're de-risking someone else who's depending upon that duty. They're creating a risk reduction by taking on that duty. They create a right in someone else. And that right, when it can be enforced, de-risks for that party that enjoys the right. So for lawyers, one of the things that lawyers tend to do in this space is they go right to the word liability. They want to know about liability and how to insulate from the risk of liability, which is secondary to the initial risk sometimes. But I think very often it's more important to go start with duties, because it's impossible to have a liability if you didn't have a duty. And I talk about the legal algorithm. You need duties. The way it works is duties, breach, causation, damages, liabilities, insurance. You can't have the next one without the one previous. So if you don't have a duty, you can't have a breach. If you don't have a breach, you can't have causation. If you don't have causation, you can't have damages. And so all those things go down the chain. So it means that if we're just jumping to liability from the first instance as lawyers, then we're missing all of those opportunities for sculpting the result of liability. And so I tend to look at duties first. And when there's an assertion of rights, I say, okay, if someone wants a right, it's a privacy right, it can be a proprietary right for a business, it could be a government national security interest. If they want a right, if there's no corresponding duty, then the right is just words on paper. And so what we need to start constructing is systems where there's mutually dependent rights and duties so that people have an interest in preserving those rights through their own observation of duties. And it's what happens every day when you stop at a red light. You're doing it because of the expectation that everyone else will be stopping at the light as well, and that de-risks the driving to work every day, et cetera. And the red light, in fact, just to go back to an earlier question, is a good example of when you have a socio-technical system, that it's not just the technology. The red light does not stop the car. The photons coming out of the light cannot stop the speeding automobile. But instead, it's a construction of legal, technical, and economic elements that go into a red light. So if I don't stop at the light, there's a rule that you stop at red, and we know that from when we're children. You don't cross in the red and all those kind of things. And there's a fine, which is the economic element, if you don't stop at the red light and you're caught. So there's always this business, legal, and technical elements to, or economic, legal, and technical elements to how these systems work. And if you start looking at technologies, you start to realize if you spend enough time with them, you realize the legal and economic elements are always there. The technology, a hammer doesn't build a house. You need a crew and a construction contract and a reason for that house to be built, et cetera. And so my expectation is that the Distributed Ledger Foundation is going to help us to unearth some of those opportunities for taking this technology, which is in quite a raw stage now. There's been some experimentation on relatively large scales, but starting to unearth some of those legal and economic, which really go hand in hand, aspects that can really make these into systems that are robust and really can be relied upon by existing businesses and in future interactions. Governance is interesting in blockchain context because you have the blockchain of the governance of the technology, but you also have governance outside of the technology. And so there's a lot of governance issues that are happening around the world in nation states and companies. And the question is, is blockchain or other things like that going to contribute to normalizing those things? That may become a how is blockchain governed question also, but it's kind of an external question. And I think a lot of what's going on, I don't really, I mean, I know the reactions now of many states have been to try to not allow these kind of technologies because of concern that they would be what I tend to refer to as computational sovereigns, which I'll get back to in a minute. But the normalization of what's happening with the governance challenges, the differentials that we have in different governments and different approaches to economics, et cetera, it'll be interesting to see whether the blockchain becomes a trans-jurisdictional authority. One of the aspirations you're starting to see is that the blockchain enables you to store information in a way that allows it to be sufficiently authoritative, that the assertion is that it can supplant the authority of what nation states have, which is the monopoly of legitimated violence. And so that's a big assertion because it doesn't do physical violence, it's a different kind of thing. But most of the narratives, most of the institutions that we rely upon, and this gets a bit theoretical, deities, royalty, countries, companies, those are the sovereigns that are out there, all of them have some form of perpetual life, which is why humans don't have perpetual life, and so they're able to sustain their narratives intergenerationally, so they become normalized. And so it'll be interesting to see with the different political systems, one-party systems, multi-party systems, et cetera, how the blockchain integrates into those governance systems and how it's normalized. But getting back to something a bit more practical, I think one of the things that's happening is all of those sovereigns that I named previously, they were deferred to. I'll assert that on the deities side and the country side, et cetera, that they're human projections out so that we can self-bind to that narrative, so that all of them are teleologies in that way. They were all projections so that we can have something to bind to at large scales. And I think what's happening now with blockchain is, again, I call it a computational sovereign. And that notion of, does it have sufficient veracity, and is it accessible in with sufficient ease over sufficient populations, that it can start to actually serve some of the roles that have traditionally been served by those other sovereigns. There was an article in Nature magazine about 2 years ago which talked about complex deities emerging at the same time as, judgmental deities emerging at the same time as complex societies. The notion being that you had to have someone, if I sell you a goat and you move 100 miles away, there's no police force to enforce the contract, the verbal contract. I need a judgmental deity to make sure you pay, that kind of thing. And so one of the questions will be, are there some things that aren't being de-risked right now by existing institutions? And I think we know there are all sorts of global challenges. We have global finance, strategic metals, water, climate change, a variety of things, pollution issues, et cetera, that the existing institutions are not able to address. It'll be interesting to see from a governance perspective whether blockchain and other structures like that can start to elicit enough following and adoption so they start to create authorities that might start to address those non-economic problems in some cases as well.